He bought her to test her, but he never expected to love her. The ledger lay open on the rough-hewn table, its pages a testament to a decade of small hopes and crushing failures. Elara traced the final, damning sum with a finger raw from needlework. It was an impossible figure, a mountain of debt her father's gentle heart and failing carpentry business could never surmount. Each scratch of the quill was a ghost of a promise, each number a link in the chain now tightening around their lives. Her father sat by the cold hearth, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed to shrink his very frame, the proud artisan reduced to a silhouette of despair. The air in their small cottage was thick with the silence of shame. When the knock came, it was sharp and imperious, a sound utterly alien to their quiet street. Elara opened the door to a man cloaked in the gray twilight, his form tall and imposing against the fading light. His face was a study in severe lines and shadows, dominated by a jaw that looked as if it were carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. A faint, silver scar cut through one dark eyebrow, a flaw in an otherwise formidable mask. He introduced himself only as Mr. Thorne, steward to the Duke of Blackwood, a name spoken in the village only in hushed, fearful whispers. The Duke was a recluse, a phantom who owned everything and was seen by no one. Mr. Thorne's gaze swept their sparse room, lingering on the ledger, then on Elara's capable, needle-pricked hands. He did not offer pity. He offered a transaction. The Duke has need of a master seamstress for an extended tenure at the manor, he stated, his voice a low baritone that held no warmth. He is willing to acquire your father's debt in exchange for your service, an indenture of 1 year. It was not a negotiation. It was a pronouncement, to be sold. The word, unspoken, hung between them, ugly and cold. Her father began to protest, a flicker of his old pride igniting, but Elara silenced him with a touch. She saw the truth of their position in the stark clarity of the steward's eyes. This was not charity. This was a claiming. She met the man's unyielding stare, lifting her chin with a dignity that felt like the only thing she truly owned. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. He bought her to test her, but he never expected to love her. He saw only a component in his cynical experiment, a subject to be observed. And she saw only a cold-hearted functionary, the face of their ruin and their only, desperate salvation. The journey to Blackwood Manor was made in a stark, black carriage that moved like a hearse through the brooding countryside. An oppressive sky, the color of bruised plums, hung low over the moors, threatening a rain that never fell. The manor itself rose from the mist-shrouded hills not as a home, but as a fortress. Its stone walls were dark with age and lichen, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over a desolate landscape. There was no welcome, only the creak of the massive oak doors and the echoing silence of the marble entryway. Elara was shown to a small, cold room in the servants' wing, furnished with little more than a cot and a sewing table. Her first assignment, delivered by a grim-faced housekeeper, was a pile of the estate's linens. Sheets worn thin, curtains heavy with dust and time. It was thankless, isolating work, meant to humble. She was to see no one, speak to no one. Her world shrank to the thread, the needle, and the 4 stone walls of her room. Mr. Thorne was a constant, unnerving presence. He was, she was told, the Duke's most trusted man, the iron hand that managed the sprawling, neglected estate. He would appear without a sound, his shadow falling over her work, his critical eye inspecting every stitch. "The Duke expects perfection," he would murmur, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He would pick up a mended sheet, holding it to the light, searching for the slightest flaw. He seemed to take a grim satisfaction in her labor, yet his gaze lingered on her hands, noting the grace and efficiency of her movements, the quiet resolve in her posture. He was testing her, she knew, pushing her, waiting for her to break, to complain, to reveal the avarice or weakness he so clearly expected to find in a woman bought and paid for. But Elara gave him nothing. She poured her grief and her pride into her work. Her stitches were flawless, her repairs almost invisible. She did not weep or rail against her fate. She simply endured, her quiet dignity a shield he could not seem to penetrate. This resilience, this refusal to be the victim he had cast her as, began to chip away at his cold composure, replacing his certainty with a reluctant, unsettling intrigue. He had designed the cage, yet the bird within refused to sing a song of sorrow. A week into her indenture, a gale swept in from the sea, throwing itself against the manor with a primal fury. Rain lashed the windows and wind howled through the eaves like a tormented spirit. Sleep was impossible. A persistent, violent banging echoed from a distant wing of the house, a frantic counterpoint to the storm's roar. Driven by a need for action, for anything other than the silent contemplation of her circumstances, Elara lit a candle and went in search of the sound. She found its source in a long-abandoned gallery, where a tall casement window had been torn from its latch. It slammed back and forth in the wind, threatening to shatter. And there, wrestling with the heavy wood, was Mr. Thorne. His coat was gone. His shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. As he fought to secure the window, a sudden gust tore it from his grasp, slamming his arm against the broken frame. He swore, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and stumbled back. Elara rushed forward, her candle casting dancing shadows on the wall. A deep gash ran along his forearm, welling with dark blood. It was just above the old, jagged scar she had noticed before, a pale track of long-healed violence. "You're hurt," she stated, her voice devoid of its usual deference. "It is nothing," he bit out, his jaw tight with pain and frustration. She ignored him. Setting the candle down, she tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her apron. "Hold still," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. He was so taken aback by her sudden authority that he obeyed. Her touch, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. She cleaned the wound with a practiced efficiency, her fingers moving with the same sureness as they did with a needle and thread. He flinched as she bound the cloth tightly around his arm, the simple, human contact a jolt to his system. He looked down at her, at the focused frown on her brow, the way the candlelight softened the weary lines around her eyes. For the first time, he was not Duke Alaric of Blackwood, cynical and calculating, observing his specimen. He was merely a man, wounded and being tended to by a woman whose compassion he had done nothing to earn. He had expected her to be frightened of him, or perhaps to see his injury as an opportunity. Instead, she offered only simple, unadorned kindness. In that moment, the foundation of his cruel test cracked, and through that fissure, an unwelcome and dangerous light began to shine. In the days that followed, the rigid formality between them began to fray. Alaric, still masquerading as the steward Thorne, found himself manufacturing reasons to seek her out. He would appear at her door with a small scuttle of coal for the meager fire in her room, claiming the chill in the manor was a nuisance. He would bring her a tray of food himself, dismissing the housekeeper with a curt nod, under the pretense of discussing the next mending project. These moments became the axis on which his days turned. He would stand by her sewing table, watching her hands transform torn fabric into something whole again, and he would ask her questions. At first they were simple, but they soon deepened. He learned of the village she missed, of the scent of baking bread from the shop down the lane, of the joy she found in the intricate patterns of lace. She spoke of her life not as a tragedy, but as a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and quiet beauty. "You do not seem to miss the finer things," he observed one evening, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Elara paused, her needle hovering over a damask curtain. "I miss my father's laugh," she said simply. "I miss the sun in our garden. Those are the finest things I have ever known." Her answer was a quiet indictment of his entire world, a world of gilded cages and loveless alliances. Each conversation was a revelation. He had sought to prove that everyone, when faced with the lure of wealth and power, possessed a core of greed. He had constructed this test to validate his own deep-seated cynicism, a shield forged after a bitter betrayal years ago. But Alara was not playing her part. She was gentle but not weak, poor but not covetous, captive but not broken. He was drawn to her authenticity like a man starving for sustenance, and the lie he was living became a bitter, indigestible poison in his own throat. The steward's mask was growing heavier by the day, and the duke beneath it was beginning to suffocate. The arrival of a letter bearing the crest of the neighboring Ashworth estate shattered Alaric's carefully constructed world. It announced the imminent arrival of Lady Genevieve Ashworth, the woman his family and all of society presumed he would one day marry. Her visit was a stark reminder of his duties, of the ducal role he had been shirking in his obsessive observation of a seamstress. Panic, an emotion he despised, coiled in his gut. The thought of Genevieve's polished artifice and dismissive gaze near Alara was unbearable. That afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't try to understand, he went to Alara. "Come with me," he said, his tone urgent. "There is something I wish you to see." He led her from the oppressive gloom of the manor, through a winding path overgrown with ivy, to a heavy iron gate half hidden behind a curtain of tangled thorns. With a grating screech, he forced it open, revealing a walled garden. It was a ruin. Weeds choked ornate stone pathways, and fountains were dry and cracked. It was a place of profound neglect. Yet, in the very center, defying the decay around it, a single ancient rosebush thrived, covered in defiant, blood-red blossoms. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He did not say the Duchess's. He said my mother's. "She loved it. After she died, I let it go." It was the most honest thing he had ever told her. He was showing her his failure, his grief, a piece of the wounded heart he kept hidden from the world. Alara stepped forward and gently touched one of the perfect blooms, its velvet petals a stark contrast to the thorns. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It's just waiting." A fragile understanding passed between them, a sense of shared sorrow and the possibility of regrowth. The air was still and warm, filled with the scent of roses and damp earth. He looked at her, her simple brown dress looking more beautiful to him than any silk gown, her face illuminated by a profound empathy. He felt a desperate urge to confess everything. But as he drew a breath to speak, the distinct sound of a carriage and horses echoed from the front of the manor. Alaric froze, the warmth draining from his face. Lady Genevieve had arrived early. The real world, with all its cruel expectations and rigid hierarchies, had just breached the walls of their sanctuary. The presence of Lady Genevieve was like a shard of ice in the heart of the manor. She was flawlessly beautiful, impeccably dressed, and possessed a voice that dripped with condescending sweetness. She moved through the halls of Blackwood as if she already owned them, her gaze sweeping over the dusty furniture and faded tapestries with a critical air. She treated Alaric with a possessive familiarity, calling him by his title in a way that was both a caress and a claim. To Alara, she was utterly invisible, a piece of the household staff unworthy of notice. For Alara, the change in Mr. Thorne was the most painful blow. In Genevieve's presence, he became the Duke. He was formal, distant, his face once again an impenetrable mask. He hosted dinners in the cavernous dining hall, the long table gleaming with silver he and Alara had never used. She would catch glimpses of him, dressed in fine velvet, his laughter sounding hollow as he played the part of the gracious host. The chasm between their worlds had never seemed so vast and impassable. He was a duke, and she was the servant he had bought. One night, unable to bear the sounds of strained merriment from the dining hall, Alara sought refuge in the warmth of the vast, empty kitchens. She was slicing a loaf of bread, the simple, domestic act of comfort, when a shadow fell across the table. It was Alaric. He had shed his formal ducal coat, and in the flickering firelight, he looked once more like the steward she knew, his shoulders slumped with weariness. They stood in silence for a long moment. He watched her hands, the rhythmic motion of the knife, the dusting of flour on her fingers. Without a word, he reached out and took the slice of bread she had just cut, still warm from the hearth. He ate it slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The shared, simple act was more intimate, more profoundly connecting than any conversation they had ever had. It was an admission of his hunger, not just for food, but for the simplicity and truth she represented. The air grew thick with unspoken words. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He smelled of wine and wood smoke. He lifted a hand, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his touch both a question and a plea. His eyes were dark with a desperate, agonizing conflict. He leaned in, his lips just a breath from hers, and then, with a shudder, he pulled back. The moment hung between them, a promise made and broken in the same heartbeat. Lady Genevieve was no fool. She had seen the way the Duke's eyes followed the little seamstress, the unnatural tension that crackled in the air whenever they were in the same room. Her suspicion, sharpened by jealousy, became a cruel weapon. She found her opportunity one afternoon when Alara was in the library, carefully mending the spine of a fragile, leather-bound book. "You are quite diligent," Lady Genevieve said, her voice a silken threat. She glided into the room, trailing the scent of expensive French perfume. "One must admire such industry. The Duke values loyalty and hard work in his staff." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Tell me," she continued, her eyes gleaming with malice, "has His Grace, Alaric, Duke of Blackwood, found your service to be satisfactory?" The name Alaric and the title struck Alara like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. His Grace. Her gaze flew from Genevieve's triumphant smirk to the wall above the grand marble fireplace. There hung a massive, oil-painted portrait she had never truly noticed before. It depicted a younger man in the full, formal regalia of a duke. His expression was prouder, less haunted, but there was no mistaking him. The severe line of his jaw, the dark, intense eyes, the faint scar that cut through his eyebrow. It was him. It was Mr. Thorne. The world tilted on its axis. Every shared moment, every quiet conversation, every flicker of vulnerability she had witnessed, was cast in a new, horrifying light. The garden, the story of his mother, the wound she had tended, the bread shared in the firelight, the near kiss, it was all a lie, a monstrous, calculated deception. He wasn't a steward testing her mettle. He was a bored, cynical aristocrat playing a game with a woman whose life he had purchased. The kindness she had treasured was a lie. The connection she had felt was a lie. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. Outside, as if on cue, the bruised sky finally broke, and a cold, merciless rain began to lash against the library windows. She found him in his study, the room where he had first interviewed her as Mr. Thorne. He stood by the window watching the storm, but turned as she entered. The look on her face told him everything. The game was over. "Was it all a game, Your Grace?" she asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, stripped of all warmth, all emotion. It was the voice of a stranger. A test? A little diversion to see if the common girl was greedy, or foolish, or desperate enough. "Tell me, did I pass your test?" "Alara," he began, his own voice hoarse. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. "It started that way. I am a cynical man. But it changed." She flinched back as if his touch would burn her. Changed into what? A more elaborate cruelty? The dam of her composure finally broke, not with tears, but with a cold, righteous fury. "You watched me. You judged me. You let me believe there was a connection between us, a bond between two lonely people. But it was always a lie. It began with a duke and a seamstress, and it ends that way. I am not a character in your private melodrama." He had no defense. Every word was the truth. His motives, which had seemed so clear and justified in the beginning, now felt like the pathetic excuses of a coward. "Please," he whispered, "don't go. You bought my service, not my soul," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The debt is paid." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She packed her few meager belongings, wrapped them in her shawl, and walked out of the grand front doors of Blackwood Manor. She refused his frantic offers of a carriage, of money, of anything. Her pride was the only thing he hadn't taken from her, and she would not sell it now. She walked down the long, winding drive in the pouring rain, never once looking back, leaving Duke Alaric of Blackwood utterly alone in the echoing silence of his gilded cage. The manor became a tomb. The silence Alaric had once cultivated now mocked him, amplifying the echo of Alara's final words. He sent Lady Genevieve away with a cold finality that left no room for protest. He wandered the empty halls, the portrait in the library a constant accusation. He saw Alara everywhere, in the neatly stacked linens, in the scent of roses from the neglected garden, in the warmth of the kitchen hearth. He had set out to prove a bitter truth about the world and had only succeeded in proving what a fool he was. The wound he had carried for years, the one he blamed on a faithless debutante and the brutalities of war, was nothing compared to the wound he had just inflicted upon himself. He had found something pure and true, and he had destroyed it with his own arrogance. Weeks bled into a month of self-imposed exile. It was his solicitor, arriving with estate papers, who brought the news. The River Ash had overflowed its banks after the storms, devastating the low-lying villages. Alara's was among the worst hit. The man mentioned it casually, a footnote in a report on lost tithes and ruined crops. But for Alaric, the words were a physical blow. He pictured her, her cottage washed away, her father's workshop destroyed. He didn't think. He acted. He shed his ducal finery, dressing in the simple, durable clothes of a traveler. He rode not in a carriage bearing his crest, but on a single, sturdy horse with no groom or guard. When he reached the village, it was a scene of heartbreaking devastation. Mud and debris were everywhere. Families were trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their homes. He found Alara beside the ruins of her cottage, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw, her expression one of grim determination as she and her father sorted through a pile of splintered timber. She saw him approach and her body went rigid. Her father moved to stand in front of her, a frail but determined shield. Alaric stopped a few feet away. He didn't offer apologies or explanations. He didn't offer a purse heavy with coin. He simply slid from his horse, removed his coat, and began to work. He lifted a heavy, mud-caked beam that her father was struggling with, his muscles straining. He worked all day, hauling debris, clearing mud, his ducal hands, soft and accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen, becoming blistered and calloused. He did not speak unless spoken to. He asked for nothing, not even food or water. He was not a duke offering charity. He was just a man, offering his strength, earning his place among them with the currency of sweat and silence. For 3 days he worked, from dawn until the last light faded from the sky. He ate the simple stew the villagers shared and slept in a corner of the half-repaired livery stable. He was earning their respect, one painful, laborious task at a time. On the evening of the 3rd day, the new frame of Alara's family cottage stood silhouetted against a sunset of brilliant orange and gold. The storm had passed. Alara approached him as he stood washing the mud from his hands in a bucket of water. She held out a simple tin cup. "Water," she said, her voice quiet. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. The small shock of contact was still there. "Why are you here?" she asked, the question soft but direct. There was no anger left in her voice, only a deep, weary confusion. He looked at his hands, at the blisters and cuts that marked them. "Because this is real," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion and emotion. "The mud, the ache in my back, rebuilding something that was broken. This is real. My title, my cynicism, the cruel test I put you through." That was the lie. He finally met her eyes, his own filled with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. "I love you, Alara." Not as a duke commanding a subject, but as a man who was lost until he met the woman who showed him what his soul was missing. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I only ask for a chance to earn it." He finished the water and set the cup down. Then, Slowly he held out his hand. It was not the hand of a steward or a duke. It was the hand of a workman, scarred, dirty, and utterly honest. Alara looked at that hand, then into his eyes. She saw the truth there, stripped of all artifice and pride. She saw the man, not the title. After a long, silent moment that held the weight of their entire story, she placed her own hand into his. The Duke of Blackwood married a common seamstress. Society was scandalized for a season, but the whispers eventually faded. At Blackwood Manor, the grand halls were filled with light and laughter for the first time in a generation. But the heart of the home was not the ballroom or the library. It was the walled garden, once a ruin, now meticulously restored and blooming with a riot of color. There, a duke with calloused hands and a seamstress with a queenly heart built a life together, not on a foundation of wealth or status, but on something far stronger, something they had laid with their own hands.